If you made it this far, you already know this isn't just another viral moment that disappears in 24 hours. This is one of those situations that quietly redraws lines in hip-hop, media, and power, and the next move could come when nobody expects it. A post. A clip. A response that flips the entire narrative again. And when it happens, you do not want to be hearing about it secondhand. That's why you need to lock in right now. Hit that like button because it tells the algorithm these conversations matter, not the watered-down headlines, but the real breakdowns that connect the dots. Drop a comment and say where you stand, because this moment has no clear hero and no clean villain, and your voice is part of what keeps the conversation honest. And most importantly, subscribe and turn notifications on, because this story is still breathing. Camron spoke carefully for a reason. Jim Jones hasn't had the final word. And 50 Cent. History says he never throws a line like that unless he's ready for the ripple effect. Whether this cools off quietly or explodes into something much bigger, you're going to want context when the next chapter hits. We're watching every move, every reaction, every silence. And when the energy shifts again, because it always does, you'll be right here, already ahead of the story instead of scrambling to catch up. Stay connected. Stay alert. Because in moments like this, the next headline is never far behind. The moment 50 Cent typed those words, the internet didn't just react, it detonated. One sentence. One offhand flex. And suddenly, the entire hip-hop media ecosystem was on fire. I'll buy the podcast. That was it. No explanation. No follow-up. No emojis. Just a cold, calculated statement that felt less like a joke and more like a warning shot. Within minutes, timelines froze. Group chats exploded. And everyone asked the same question at the same time: did 50 Cent just threaten to take over Jim Jones and Maino's platform, on purpose? Because let's be clear, this wasn't random. This wasn't playful banter. This wasn't a troll comment tossed into the void. This was 50 Cent doing what he has done his entire career, asserting dominance with a smile, money in hand, and chaos in his wake. And the reason it hit so hard is because it landed right in the middle of something already fragile: pride, ownership, and old wounds that never fully healed. Jim Jones and Maino's podcast had been gaining momentum. The conversations were bold. The takes were unfiltered. And the tone felt independent, no corporate leash, no industry babysitter. That's why fans immediately felt the shift when 50's comment went viral. Because in hip-hop, ownership isn't just business. It's identity. It's survival. It's proof you can speak without permission. So when someone like 50 casually implies he could buy that voice, control that platform, and flip the entire narrative, it doesn't land as comedy. It lands as a challenge. Insiders say the energy changed instantly behind the scenes. Phones started ringing. Text messages flew. People close to Jim allegedly asked him if he was going to respond immediately or let it breathe. Maino, known for his calm demeanor, was reportedly furious but measured, because reacting emotionally is exactly what 50 wants. And that's the trap. Because 50 doesn't argue. He pressures. He waits. He watches people expose themselves. Then Camron entered the picture, and that's when this stopped being just another headline. Cam didn't rush to social media. He didn't fire off insults. He didn't play to the crowd. Instead, he spoke like someone who understands the weight behind that sentence. Because Cam knows 50. He knows the game. He knows the difference between jokes and power plays. And according to those close to him, the moment he heard the clip, he didn't laugh. He paused. Because Camron is tied to this story in ways most fans forget. Dipset history. Brotherhood. Betrayal. Reconciliation that never fully stuck. Jim Jones isn't just a rapper to Cam, he's a chapter of his life. And when 50 inserted himself into that space with money on the table, it reopened old dynamics that never truly closed. Cam's reaction, when it finally came, wasn't loud, but it was heavy. He questioned the move without dismissing the power behind it. He acknowledged that 50 doesn't speak carelessly. That when he says something like that, it's never accidental. And that alone sent chills through the fanbase. Because Cam wasn't hyping the moment. He was contextualizing it. And context makes things dangerous. Meanwhile, social media did what it always does, it chose sides and poured gasoline on the fire. One camp praised 50, calling it a boss move, saying Jim and Maino should have known better than to speak on him without expecting retaliation. Another camp called it disrespectful, arguing that threatening to buy someone's platform crosses an unspoken line, especially in a culture built on independence. Old clips resurfaced. Past interviews where 50 talked about ownership, leverage, and control started circulating. So did footage of Cam speaking on industry politics years ago, warning artists about letting power dynamics override relationships. Fans weren't just reacting to the moment, they were reinterpreting history through it. And then the rumors started. Alleged insiders claimed that the comment shook more than just egos. That conversations with lawyers and business partners quietly began. That producers connected to the podcast started asking uncomfortable questions. Not because a sale was happening, but because perception alone can shift negotiations, sponsors, and leverage. That's the part people underestimate. In media, you don't have to actually buy something to destabilize it. You just have to make people believe you could. Camron seemed to understand that instantly. His response wasn't defensive, it was reflective. Almost like he was saying, be careful how far this goes. Not to protect 50. Not to shield Jim. But to remind everyone watching that once money enters a personal dispute, there's no clean exit. What made it even more explosive was the silence from 50 afterward. No clarification. No follow-up joke. No backtracking. Just quiet. And when 50 goes quiet after dropping a line like that, it usually means he's already moved on, or he's waiting for someone else to make the next mistake. By the end of the day, one thing was undeniable. This wasn't about a podcast anymore. It was about control versus voice. Money versus pride. Old kings versus evolving platforms. And Camron's involvement turned it from spectacle into something much more serious, a moment where hip-hop had to confront how power is exercised in the modern era. And as the dust settled, one terrifying possibility hung in the air: if this was just the opening move, what happens when someone finally responds the wrong way? Because once lines like that are crossed, the next chapter is never quiet. By the next morning, the tone had shifted from shock to strategy. This wasn't trending like a joke anymore. It was trending like a chessboard. Every move mattered. Every silence was being interpreted. And every name connected to the situation was suddenly under a microscope. Because once Camron weighed in, people stopped laughing and started listening. Behind the scenes, the whispers got louder. Alleged insiders began hinting that Jim Jones didn't take the comment lightly at all, not in the way fans expected. There was no public meltdown, no rant-filled live stream, no impulsive clapback. Instead, there was restraint. And in hip-hop, restraint is often scarier than rage. According to those close to the situation, Jim felt the comment wasn't just disrespectful, it was deliberate. A calculated attempt to undermine credibility, not through insults, but through economics. And that distinction matters. Because insults fade. Money doesn't. Maino, meanwhile, was reportedly pacing. People who know him say he hates unnecessary escalation, but he hates being underestimated even more. The podcast wasn't just content to him, it was proof of growth. Proof that voices from the street could evolve into voices of authority without being filtered or softened. So when the idea of someone buying that voice entered the chat, it struck a nerve. Not publicly. Privately. Then the alleged leaks started circulating. Screenshots, unverified but convincing, of private group chats began making the rounds. Messages that appeared to show concern, not fear. Lines like, "This ain't about jokes anymore," and, "Once he said bye, that's a different conversation." Whether real or not, they fed the narrative that something serious was unfolding beneath the surface. Fans dissected every word, every timestamp, every emoji omission like it was evidence in a trial. And 50 Cent? Still silent. That silence drove people wild. Because historically, when 50 goes quiet after making a loud statement, it means one of two things: he's either already won, or he's letting everyone else wear themselves out. Both options terrified people. Especially those who know his track record of turning moments into leverage. Camron's reaction began to be reinterpreted in real time. Clips of his response were replayed endlessly, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed for tone. Fans noticed how careful he was not to dismiss the power behind 50's words. How he didn't mock the idea. How he framed it as a moment that changed the temperature. That phrase alone became a talking point. Because temperature is what determines whether something simmers, or explodes. And then the culture jumped in. Other artists started chiming in, not directly, but enough to stir the pot. Cryptic tweets about ownership, respect, and knowing your worth popped up from people with no obvious connection to the situation. Fans speculated whether they were taking sides or simply protecting themselves from similar power plays. Media personalities debated whether 50 crossed a line or simply reminded everyone who he is. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Old grudges resurfaced. Dipset history got dragged back into the spotlight like it never left. And just when it seemed like things might plateau, a new rumor hit. An alleged insider claimed that 50's comment wasn't just talk, that he had previously explored acquiring stakes in digital platforms and media properties tied to hip-hop voices. No proof. No confirmation. But the rumor alone sent shockwaves through the fanbase. Because suddenly, the idea of buying the podcast didn't sound hypothetical anymore. It sounded like a flex rooted in experience. That's when Camron's role became even more fascinating. People close to him say he wasn't trying to play mediator. He wasn't trying to cool things down for the sake of peace. He was trying to slow the moment down so it didn't turn reckless. Because Cam understands something a lot of fans forget: once business conversations go public, egos aren't the only thing at risk. Relationships, partnerships, and long-term plans can all collapse under the weight of one poorly handled response. That's why Cam didn't hype Jim up to swing back. He didn't encourage Maino to go nuclear. He acknowledged the tension and left space. And in doing so, he may have prevented something far uglier from happening, at least for now. But that restraint didn't mean the pressure disappeared. If anything, it made the silence louder. Jim Jones fans began demanding a response. Not a rant. Not an insult. A statement. Something to reclaim ground. Meanwhile, 50 supporters flooded timelines with reminders of his past victories, his business moves, his ability to outlast and outmaneuver. The narrative wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about power, who has it, who's losing it, and who knows how to use it best. Then came the curveball. A clip resurfaced from years ago, showing Camron talking about the dangers of letting money dictate loyalty. At the time, it felt like wisdom. Now, it felt prophetic. Fans connected dots that may or may not belong together, but in the court of public opinion, perception is reality. And the perception was that Cam saw this coming long before anyone else did. Still, the biggest wildcard remained 50 Cent's next move. Would he double down? Would he clarify? Would he dismiss it as humor and let everyone breathe? Or would he let the chaos grow, knowing full well that the longer people argue about his words, the more control he holds over the narrative? Because here's the truth no one wants to admit out loud: even if 50 never buys anything, he already bought something far more valuable: attention, dominance, and a reminder that his presence alone can destabilize rooms. As the second day closed, the tension didn't fade. It sharpened. People weren't asking, "What did he mean?" anymore. They were asking, "What happens next?" Because in hip-hop, moments like this don't end quietly. They either dissolve into awkward silence, or they explode into something that changes relationships forever. And as everyone waited, fans, artists, insiders, one uncomfortable reality became impossible to ignore. The next response, whoever it comes from, could decide whether this becomes a footnote, or a full-blown fracture. Because once money, pride, and history collide in public, there's no rewind button. And the clock was ticking. By the third day, the silence had become suffocating. Not the quiet of resolution, the quiet of pressure building. The kind that makes people read into everything. Every post. Every like. Every absence. Fans weren't refreshing timelines for entertainment anymore. They were watching for signs. Because at this point, everyone knew this moment had outgrown the original comment. It had become a test of nerve, control, and legacy. Behind closed doors, the alleged tension was no longer theoretical. Insiders claimed meetings were happening. Not dramatic sit-downs, not confrontations, but calculations. People close to Jim Jones were reportedly advising caution, not because they feared 50 Cent, but because they understood him. You don't swing wildly at someone who thrives on reaction. You don't hand him momentum. You either outweight him, or you outthink him. Maino, according to whispers, was pushing for clarity. Not escalation. Clarity. Because the longer the narrative lingered without a response, the more it felt like surrender to some fans. And in hip-hop, perception can be as damaging as defeat. Still, Maino also knew that one wrong sentence could flip this from commentary into a war of egos with no winners. That internal tug-of-war, between defending pride and protecting the platform, was reportedly tearing the room in half. And Camron? Cam was watching everything unfold with the calm of someone who's seen this movie before, and knows how ugly the ending can get. People began noticing subtle shifts in his tone during unrelated conversations. Slight pauses. Carefully chosen words. As if he was aware that anything he said next could tip the scale. Cam's name started trending not because he escalated, but because people were hanging on to his restraint. In a culture addicted to chaos, restraint felt almost radical. And that made it powerful. Then, another alleged leak surfaced. This time, it wasn't screenshots. It was audio, unverified, distorted, but convincing enough to fuel another wave of speculation. A voice that sounded like someone close to the situation discussing ownership leverage and letting it sit. No names. No direct admissions. But enough to make fans believe the standoff was intentional. That nobody was rushing because rushing would mean losing. And still, 50 Cent said nothing. That silence began to feel like a presence of its own. Heavy. Intentional. Calculated. Fans familiar with his history started saying the same thing, this is when he's most dangerous. Not when he's loud. When he's watching everyone else move around his words. Speculation exploded. Was he baiting a response? Was he gauging loyalty? Was he simply enjoying the chaos he created with a single sentence? Or was there something else happening entirely behind the scenes, conversations the public would never hear, decisions that wouldn't be announced until they were already done? At the same time, industry voices started weighing in indirectly. Media figures spoke about the power of platforms. Executives hinted at how quickly narratives can shift when money enters the conversation. Creators debated whether independence truly exists when giants loom in the background. What started as a celebrity moment had turned into a cultural discussion, about who owns voices, who controls platforms, and what respect looks like in an era where everything is public. Jim Jones fans grew restless. Some demanded he clap back hard. Others urged him to stay silent and let 50's words age poorly on their own. The divide was sharp. And that division alone showed how effective the original comment had been. It didn't just provoke artists. It fractured audiences. Camron's earlier reaction began to look more strategic by the hour. He hadn't poured gasoline on the fire. He'd placed a marker. A reminder that this wasn't just about ego, it was about consequences. And now, as more voices entered the conversation, that warning echoed louder. Then came the moment that changed everything again. A short clip circulated, just seconds long, of Jim Jones being asked about the situation off camera. No rant. No explosion. Just a pause. A look. And a measured response that stopped people cold. He didn't deny. He didn't confirm. He didn't joke. He simply said, "I hear everything." That was it. Those 3 words sent shockwaves through the culture. Because, "I hear everything," isn't dismissal. It's awareness. It's acknowledgement. It's a signal that silence doesn't equal ignorance. And suddenly, the power dynamic felt less one-sided. Fans began asking a new question: what if Jim was waiting too? What if both sides were letting the other move first? Camron's role, once again, became pivotal. People speculated whether he'd step in again, or whether his first response was all he intended to give. Insiders suggested Cam had already said what needed to be said. That anything more would only muddy the waters. That sometimes the most impactful move is knowing when to exit the conversation before it consumes you. As night fell, the energy didn't cool. It crystallized. This was no longer about buying a podcast. It was about who dictates terms in a culture built on voice and visibility. It was about whether money should be spoken as a weapon. It was about how legends protect relevance without crushing the next evolution. And it was about how one sentence can expose fault lines that have existed for years. The scariest part? Everyone involved seemed fully aware of the stakes now. Fans waited for a tweet that never came. A live stream that didn't happen. A response that stayed locked behind closed doors. And in that waiting, one truth became impossible to ignore: the longer this drags on, the heavier the next move will be. Because when people who understand power stop talking publicly, it's rarely because they have nothing to say. It's because they're deciding how loud the next chapter needs to be. And as the silence stretched into something almost unbearable, one final question hung over everything, unanswered, unresolved, and dangerous. When someone finally breaks this silence, will it end the tension? Or will it set off something none of them can control? If you're still watching right now, understand this: you're already ahead of the curve. This isn't one of those stories you casually scroll past and forget. This is the kind of moment that shifts relationships, power dynamics, and entire narratives in real time. And when the next move happens, because it will, the people who weren't paying attention are going to be lost, confused, and playing catch-up. Do not be one of them. Hit that like button if you felt the tension in this situation, because it tells the algorithm this conversation deserves to stay alive. Drop a comment and say where you stand, because silence in moments like this is a choice, and the culture is watching who speaks up and who doesn't. And most importantly, subscribe and turn notifications on immediately, because this story is nowhere near finished. Camron didn't speak by accident. Jim Jones didn't choose his words lightly. And 50 Cent has never made a move without understanding exactly what it would trigger. The next response could come in an interview, a post, a leak, or a moment nobody sees coming, and when it hits, you'll want the full context, not a headline stripped of meaning. This channel doesn't wait for the aftermath. We break it down while it's happening. Stay locked in. Stay informed. Because when the silence finally breaks, it won't whisper, it will shake everything.